So our next speaker is Donald Robertson. Donald is a CBT-trained psychotherapist, and he's the author of 6 books on Stoicism. And I mentioned this before, Donald is really the super glue of the whole Stoic community. I don't think we'd be here today if it wasn't for him and the efforts and initiatives that he took to organize the Stoicism internationally. And he recently released a book called How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. And today's talk is how to practice like a Roman emperor. And so he's going to examine Marcus Aurelius' meditation and what kind of spiritual life practices can be gleaned from it. So let's give a warm welcome to Donald Robertson.
Thank you very much. Okay, hi everyone. So I did quite a formal exercise with you earlier, and you've done a lot of meditation today, which is really cool. So you'll already be pretty mellow and contemplative. Earlier we had some discussion of theory before we did the view from above, and now we're going to do some kind of discussion of strategies and concepts after having done an exercise. That's going to be interesting as well. And I'm going to go through a whole bunch of psychological exercises that are found in ancient Stoicism. So my background is in cognitive behavioral therapy, and the niche that I've kind of ended up finding myself in is talking about the psychological practices that are found in Stoicism. So I'm going to go through a whole bunch of them and give you some hints and tips about how to actually put them in practice. And because these are techniques I've been using in workshops and with clients in therapy and coaching for about 20 years now. That was how this whole thing got started. I was saying earlier, you saw a picture of the first workshop that we did at Exeter University. And I was in that group. I don't know if you spotted me in the photograph. My hair was a little bit darker then. It was a little bit less wrinkled. And that whole idea started because of an audio recording of the view from above, the same exercise that you guys did earlier. And that went online, and some students at Exeter listened to it, and they thought we should do this thing called Stoic Week, and that was how this whole thing got started, basically. But I'm going to throw in some stories as well and anecdotes to make the exercises a little bit more interesting. So we'll see how that goes. And the story I wanted to start with is about Socrates, actually, because I believe that I read the Stoics as being Socratics. And I think it's very important, it's very valuable to look at the Socratic dialogues of Plato, and perhaps even more so the ones from Xenophon, in order to put the Stoic writings and exercises in context. And a lot of the things that we find in the Stoics can be found teased earlier in Socrates, often with more supporting arguments. In Plato's Republic, I think in Book 4, and then this is returned to again at Book 10, I'm speaking from memory, so if I remember rightly, some of these references should be as I described, but you guys can fact check them later. Socrates is talking to Glaucon, Plato's brother, about the Greek tragedies. And Glaucon says, Socrates, what do you think of the tragedies? They're really cool, aren't they? You know, like when Oedipus goes crazy, because he finds out that he slept with his mother, and Medea goes crazy because she finds that her husband, Jason's had an affair, and she kills her children and stuff. It's like, we've got some awesome tragedies, and this is a high point of Greek culture. And Socrates, surprisingly, shockingly, says, well, yeah, but I don't think these people are very good role models. In fact, they're case studies in psychopathology. Maybe that's what they would be good for. And then he says the wise man wouldn't respond in the face of adversity in this way. And then in Book 10, he returns to elaborate on that. And Glaucon says, well, how then, Socrates, would a wise man respond in the face of adversity? And Socrates says, well, he would do 4 things. First of all, he would tell himself that it's never clear when something happens, whether it's ultimately good or bad. And there are 2 reasons for that. Like in the tragedies, there are many reversals of fortune in life. Somebody may lose their job, might be the best thing that ever happens to them. A relationship might break up, seems like a terrible catastrophe at the time. Maybe it's for the best in the long run. Yeah. So things that seem like catastrophes may in the long run turn out to be in our best interests. And the other reason is that someone might lose their job, like one person might cope badly with it, another person might learn from the experience. So it depends on the use that we make of these experiences. So it's not clear whether something's actually going to be good for us or bad for us. So we should kind of suspend judgment and not be unduly alarmed when we encounter what seems like a misfortune. And Glaucon says, that's interesting, Socrates. What are the other things that a wise man does in the face of adversity? And Socrates says, well, the other thing is he tells himself it's unnecessary to add another layer of suffering to something that may already be painful and unpleasant. Why would you make yourself even more upset? Why would you make yourself suffer even more when the situation that you're already facing is painful, difficult, and unpleasant? Why heap another layer of suffering on top of what's already happening? Make a bad situation worse. And Glaucon says, well, what was the third thing, Socrates? And Socrates said, well, the wise man tells himself that nothing is that important in the grand scheme of things. So for Oedipus, like finding out that he slept with his mother is like the most awful thing that he can conceivably imagine. And Medea finding out that Jason's betrayed her is this terrible, like the worst thing that's conceivable to her. And Socrates says, well, you know, like none of these things are actually that bad. Like, nothing's that bad in the grand scheme of things. And to the philosopher, that's more obvious because he looks at the bigger picture. He takes the long view. He looks at things within a broader context. And when we look at things from a broader context, nothing is that extremely awful, as we say in rational emotive behaviour therapy. It's awfulizing or catastrophizing, exaggerating the severity of the situation. And Glaucon said, but you said there were four things, Socrates. What's the fourth thing that the wise man tells himself? And Socrates says, well, the fourth thing is the most important of all, Glaucon. He said, the wise man tells himself that if he's like Oedipus or Medea and he gets really angry and really worked up, like he experiences and indulges in the irrational passions, then he's doing precisely the thing that's most unhelpful in the face of a crisis. He's preventing himself from doing what's actually required in the face of adversity, which is thinking clearly and rationally and solving the problem that he faces. Because when we indulge in irrational emotions, as the Stoics said, it's a form of temporary madness, and it prevents us from being able to think clearly about the situation we're facing and solve it rationally. So those are four strategies that Socrates mentions more concisely than that. He mentions them in a very offhand, kind of fleeting way in Plato's Republic. And that sounds pretty Stoic, right? Like, we can see echoes of those sort of ideas in the Stoic literature as well. But I don't know, would we call those exercises or not? When we talk about techniques or practices in therapy, people have different ideas about what would constitute a psychological exercise. So I would call those cognitive strategies. Those are perspectives or ways of interpreting the situation, maybe even sentences or coping statements that someone might use in the face of specific situations. So as a therapist and a trainer, I would conceive of those as psychological exercises. And there are also other types of psychological exercises that we find in cognitive therapy and in Stoicism that might involve particular lines of questioning, that might involve visualizing situations or adopting certain alternate perspectives on a situation, such as the view from above that we looked at earlier. And when I wrote my first book in Stoicism, which has just come out in a second edition, it was originally published in 2010, and it's called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. It was kind of intended for a dual audience of philosophers and professional psychotherapists. It wasn't meant to be a kind of self-help guide, although a lot of people have read it for that reason. And what I was trying to do was to make sense in my own mind of the relationship between Stoicism and psychotherapy. And part of what I did in the book was to try to list all of the psychological strategies that I could find described in the Stoic literature. So I did a survey of all the relevant literature that I could find and all the commentaries that I could find, and I tried to list and itemize the main psychological practices that I could find. And there's different ways that you could carve those techniques up. So some of them could be lumped together more in groups, or some of them could be broken down into different forms. And we could divide them into general psychological strategies, which might take the form of multiple specific types of technique. So I'll give you some examples of that as we're talking. But overall, the list I drew of distinct psychological strategies in that book, I hadn't numbered them. I went back recently and counted them. There were 18. right? So there's a whole bunch. An armamentarium is a term that used to be used in psychotherapy and medicine. The toolbox, we might say, of Stoic techniques is quite broad. And so you might ask, well, are some of them more important than others? And I think they are. Like, there are some that kind of stand out, or that the Stoics put more emphasis on, or that seem like they would be more foundational. But actually, there's not a clear-cut answer to that question, because often they seem to intersect and overlap with each other. So I'm keeping an open mind about that, and I'd be interested in what your thoughts about that are. Like, some of them do seem to be more important than others. And Marcus Aurelius, for example, at one point in the Meditations, tries to provide a summary of what he's doing in that book. So there are several places where he summarizes the strategies he's using. In Meditations 11:18, he talks about techniques for anger management, and he lists 10 distinct psychological strategies. They're all cognitive strategies for coping with anger. I think that's impressive. If I asked an audience of cognitive therapists to, off the top of their head, list 10 distinct psychological strategies for coping with anger, I think they'd come up with 5 or 6 maybe. Like, he can list 10, and we can tell he knows them very thoroughly and deeply. He keeps returning to them throughout the Meditations. But in another passage, he says, look, basically all of this boils down to 2 basic ideas, and he sums them up concisely in a short phrase. In Greek, it's only 6 words. It's very brief, laconic. So the Stoics like to compress things so that they could be easily memorized, and they were ready to hand in the face of adversity, like a coping statement or a maxim or an affirmation in therapy today. He says, the universe is change, life is opinion. And luckily we know what he meant by that, because in the preceding passage he kind of elaborates on it a little bit. And it's a beautiful little concise expression of the Stoicism of the Meditations anyway, because he happens to be clearly referring to 2 philosophers, and the 2 philosophers he cites most frequently throughout that book. The universe is change is a reference to Heraclitus, like the pre-Socratic philosopher, whom Marcus refers to almost as often as Epictetus, his favourite philosopher. And the second part, life is opinion, is a clear reference to Epictetus. I'll come back to that in a moment and elaborate on it. Just as an aside, John earlier talked about the idea of illusion and the view from above and perspective shifting as a way of dealing with the illusion in life. And the Cynics and Stoics actually have a word for illusion. The Cynics called it tuphos. And the Stoics sometimes use this word as well. It means smoke or mist, like a smoke screen, or like smoke and mirrors. And the Cynics said we're surrounded by tuphos all the time in the world. And Marcus Aurelius, in another famous passage, I believe it's the last passage, I can't remember which number it is, but in book 2 of the Meditations, he says, life is a sojourn in a foreign land, life is warfare and a sojourn in a foreign land. And he says, everything to do with the body is like a flowing river, and everything to do with the mind is like a mist or a vapor, tuphos. Like the passions are a kind of smokescreen, an illusion. So these are 2 fundamental parts of his philosophy that he keeps returning to, and looking at the world in terms of these 2 concepts is a kind of foundational psychological practice that Marcus employs. And many of the other techniques, visualization techniques, verbal techniques that he refers to, kind of relate in some way or another back to these 2 basic concepts. And one of them relates to our experience of external things, the nature of the world, that is constantly changing. Like, you can't step into the same river twice, like Heraclitus said. And when Marcus says life is change, he means everything's constantly in flux. But he also means when we look at the bigger picture, when we expand our perspective, we see that the present moment is just one small part of the picture and it's transient. And life is change also means that life is death. Like, it means that when we think about the transience of things, we have to come to terms with our own mortality. And contemplating our own mortality, as you probably know, is one of the major themes of Stoicism and of the Meditations as well. So that's kind of being alluded to indirectly in that short phrase. And life is opinion means that the quality of our life is shaped by our judgments, particularly our value judgments, according to the Stoics. And I'll come back to that because it's one of the most important concepts in Stoicism. So here are some of the practices that I like to go through. Cognitive behavioral therapy, and I'll speak more to that in a moment, is influenced by Stoicism. But not a lot of people know this. There was actually an earlier attempt to integrate Stoicism in Western psychotherapy. Nothing to do with Freud and psychodynamic or psychoanalytic therapy. At the beginning of the 20th century, there was a rival to Freud, a guy called Paul Dubois, who was a Swiss psychotherapist and a neurologist. And Dubois really liked Seneca and tried to assimilate Seneca's thought. He would prescribe reading the letters of Seneca to his patients, and he developed a form of psychotherapy called rational psychotherapy, or persuasion psychotherapy as it's sometimes known, that was for a time competed with Freudian psychoanalysis and was influenced by Stoicism. But the bit of Stoicism that Dubois and his colleagues emphasized is slightly different from the bit that came to be emphasized later. What they emphasized was the bit that we call today the dichotomy of control. So the dichotomy of the control is the distinction between what's up to us and what isn't. And I like to frame it as being the distinction between what we do and what merely happens to us in life. It's the distinction between what's under our voluntary control and everything else. Or as Epictetus puts it, what's up to us, in a word, are our own actions, our voluntary actions. And that's distinguished in Stoicism or demarcated from everything else. It's famously encapsulated in the Serenity Prayer. Give me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So this is a kind of obvious psychological strategy, and it was integral to early 20th century rational psychotherapy, but not so much emphasized in modern cognitive behavioral therapy, although there are some things that kind of resemble it. And I'll just give you a couple of quick examples. There's a thing that we do often in cognitive therapy where somebody excessively blames themselves for a situation. And I used to work with road traffic accident, RTA victims, and they often were traumatized and blamed themselves for accidents that they'd been in. And so very often I would ask them to draw maybe a pie chart and to split up in segments what factors were to blame for the accident. Or I'd ask them from 0 to 100%, how much control did you have? So I'd begin by saying, look, from 0 to 100%, how much do you feel as if you're to blame for what happened? And they'd usually say 100% or 95% or something like that. And then I'd say, let's have a think about it. Like, rationally speaking, from 0 to 100%, how much control did you actually have over the outcome? And they might say 5% or often 0%. So then I'd say, voila. Like, how is it possible that you can be 100% to blame, but 0% in control? Surely these things don't really make sense side by side, yeah? So getting them to realize that they've been taking too much responsibility for things that aren't actually under their control is an obvious and integral part of that type of therapy. But really it has much more pervasive value than that would imply. Another technique that you can employ, a very simple way of doing that, would be just to draw two columns describing a situation you're facing, and in one column list the situations that you're worried about, the aspects of the situation that you're worried about, and in the other column list the aspects that are actually under your direct control. And just kind of sorting through or parsing things in that way can often be tremendously helpful. Just takes a little bit of time and reflection. And so that idea is closely related to another Stoic technique called the reserve clause that has to do with undertaking action. So Stoics say that whenever we undertake any action, we should also always do so with the caveat, I will do such and such, fate permitting, or I will do such and such if nothing prevents me. Acknowledging that the intention to achieve some goal and the actions that we take from moment to moment are under our control, but the eventual outcome might not be. So it entails distinguishing between what's up to us and what is not. A famous example of that is in Lucan's Pharsalia, an epic poem that describes the Roman Civil War, and it was written by Seneca's nephew, who was also a Stoic. We have most of it surviving today. I think we're missing one chapter. And in the Pharsalia, Cato, who is organizing the remnants of the Republican army to fight against Caesar, is marching through the desert, and one of his officers finds a shrine to Zeus. And they say, well, we should consult this shrine to find out what the outcome of the battle is going to be. That was a very common thing for Roman generals to do. They wanted to consult a shrine and get a prophecy about who would win the battle. And Cato in the Pharsalia, in this kind of really epic fragment, says, no, I don't need to. For a start, I don't believe that God lives in a shrine or that I have to speak to him through priests, because I'm a Stoic, I'm a pantheist. I believe that God is everywhere. And everything that I need to know, he's already implanted inside my heart, so I have no need to consult a shrine. And Cato also says it doesn't matter whether we win or lose. I've already accepted the possibility that we might lose the forthcoming battle. Either way, I'm going to do the same thing. If the shrine tells me we're going to win, I'm going to fight Caesar. If the shrine tells me I'm going to lose, I'm still going to fight Caesar, because it's the right thing to do. We're opposing a dictatorship. So the reserve clause, Cato says, I'm going to undertake this action in the service of my moral principles while accepting that we might fail or we might succeed. That's not under my direct control. In Cicero's De Finibus, he describes a famous metaphor which he puts in the mouth of Cato. And he says, think of it like an archer or a spearman. So imagine someone's throwing a spear at a target. And I think this example works better if you imagine the target's an animal and the spearman is hunting. So he can throw the spear to the best of his ability and he'll aim at the target, the wild boar that he's hunting, let's say. But he can't control if it suddenly darts off in the opposite direction. He might miss it. So all that he can do is what's under his ability, under his control, to the best of his ability, and then he has to accept the outcome, whether it's success or failure. And that's sportsmanlike, if you like. He's just doing his best and not grumbling if he's unlucky in the hunt, for instance. And that idea is related to something that we can also call Stoic acceptance. So Epictetus, regarding the reserve clause, says it's like saying I want to do such and such, and at the same time keep my volition, my will, in harmony with nature by accepting the outcome even if it doesn't go my way. Epictetus also famously said, do not seek for things to turn out as you desire, but wish for them to be as they are, and your life will go smoothly. So this is a kind of form of rational acceptance. And the Stoics don't mean a kind of passivity by that. They mean trying your best to do what's wise and just in life, but accepting the reality of your situation would be a better way of putting it. Being brutally honest with yourself and not grumbling unnecessarily about things, but accepting what happens. This idea of Stoic acceptance kind of is in some ways an inheritance from the Cynic concept of voluntary hardship, which actually reminds me a little bit of the breathing exercise that we just did. Because in modern cognitive behavioral therapy and third wave therapy, we often teach clients to endure voluntary discomfort. And that might be through holding their breath, for example. And one reason for doing that is to teach clients a tolerance of uncomfortable or unpleasant sensations. Because some people are much more intolerant of those things than others, and that can often cause them problems in life. It can cause them emotional or psychological problems. But you can train yourself to become more accepting of discomfort. And Marcus Aurelius rightly says in the Meditations that if you do that with one feeling, you should also tell yourself that other feelings are just the same. They're all just bodily sensations. So if you hold your breath and can come to terms with the discomfort of that, you can learn to view it as just a sensation. You can do the same thing when you're at the dentist and tell yourself it's just the same as when I was holding breath. It's just a different sort of bodily sensation. They're all just bodily sensations. He says fatigue, illness, like they're all the same. Like the Stoic response is basically the same. They're just bodily sensations. And we can employ similar strategies to cope with them. So when we're training those skills on a specific sensation, we should think of them as generalizable, in other words. Marcus says to himself when enduring an uncomfortable sensation, he literally says, is this unbearable? Like he's challenging himself. This sensation, when taken in isolation, is it really unbearable? People tend to say, I can't handle it, it's too much, it's unbearable. So he challenges himself to question whether this moment alone is really that overwhelming. Is it really too much for me? Because we can tolerate, we can bear most of these things if we take them one step at a time in small slices. So this idea also kind of leads us into the concept of premeditatio malorum, which I like to call the premeditation of adversity. William Irving calls it negative visualization, but I don't really like that term because the thing that the Stoic is visualizing isn't framed as negative. In fact, it would be more like indifference visualization. The idea for Stoics is that we should confront situations that seem like misfortune, like death, exile, poverty, other setbacks in life, and train ourselves to view them with Stoic indifference, to accept the discomfort, the awkwardness of them, and to kind of ride it out, like to realize that these things aren't necessarily the end of the world, to employ some of the cognitive strategies that earlier on I mentioned Socrates talking about. So the Stoics kind of do two things. When they're undertaking a specific action, they'll in advance picture that it might turn out badly for them and rehearse coping with that. Like in the example of Cato leading the Republican army against Julius Caesar. But also they'll picture, as Seneca often mentions, a variety of different misfortunes that may be unlikely to actually happen to them in practice. And we get the same distinction in modern therapy in what we call imaginal exposure training. So we can get clients to cope with specific challenges that they face. Maybe they're going to have surgery and they're anxious about it, by picturing that specific situation as vividly and realistically as possible and rehearsing that in a controlled manner in specific ways in their mind, but also to build a more general form of psychological resilience. We know that what helps is not to focus on one challenge, but on a wide variety of different situations. And we can see Seneca talking about that in the letters to Lucilius and elsewhere. For me, the most important Stoic technique, though, is the one that's mentioned in Enchiridion 5. And one of the reasons it's particularly prominent for me is that it is that quote, that particular passage in the Enchiridion was used by Albert Ellis, the founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, way back in the 1950s, one of the pioneers of modern CBT, and he taught this quote to every client, the quote that goes, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. That's what upsets us." And that's what Marcus is alluding to when he says life is opinion, that it's not things that upset us, but our opinions about things. That encapsulates what we call today the cognitive model of emotion. And that's the basic premise of all cognitive therapy. So Ellis found an easy way to teach that to clients in therapy was just to show them that quote from Epictetus. And that's one of the reasons there's a kind of historical intersection between Stoicism and modern cognitive behavioral therapy. Although I have to say, most modern cognitive behavioral therapists, that may be all they know about the Stoics, just that one quote, unfortunately. Although they would benefit, I think, from reading more about Stoicism. In many cases, they'll know that quote from Epictetus, but maybe literally nothing else about Stoicism. But it's an important quote. It's fundamental to Stoicism. I call it cognitive distancing or cognitive catharsis. And it's mentioned in the Socratic dialogues of Plato and also in the dialogues of Xenophon. And so I like to think it may go all the way back to Socrates himself. And actually, Epictetus seems to know that. He hints at it, because in the next sentence, his example is Socrates. He says, if death were inherently awful and fearsome, then Socrates would have been frightened of dying. But he wasn't. Therefore, like the anxiety, the terror that people feel towards death must come from their attitude towards it. And so one of the ways that we illustrate the subjectivity of these emotions, the fact that they come from our value judgments projected onto things, is by asking ourselves, do other people feel differently about the same situation? And that's an age-old strategy. We find it in Xenophon and Plato as well, in the mouth of Socrates. If other people aren't upset by this situation, if they feel differently about it, then maybe it's not the situation that's upsetting you, maybe it's your attitude towards it. There are many good examples of this in the Socratic dialogues. I think one of my favourites is in Book 1 of the Republic, which many people believe presents a more authentic picture of Socrates and was maybe written earlier by Plato. And in it, Socrates visits a wealthy elderly man that he's friends with, a foreign immigrant in Athens called Cephalus. And Cephalus is an old man, and Socrates hasn't seen him for a number of years. And he says, look, Cephalus, like, just as if I was embarking on a journey and I met somebody that was returning, I might ask them, what's the territory like ahead? Like, what sort of things am I going to encounter on the rest of my journey? Because you've been ahead of me. Like, you're ahead of me in life, like, because you're older than me by several decades. What's it like being an elderly person? And Cephalus says to him, well, I hang around with a lot of other old guys because birds of a feather like to flock together. And the one thing I notice about them is they like to complain, but I don't. So what that tells me is whether it's good or bad isn't a matter of the aches and pains or the health problems or other limitations that go with old age itself, but I believe it's more down to the attitude that you have towards it. Because if it was inherently awful, then everyone would feel the same way about it. And some people are happy in old age. There are positive aspects to it. And he mentions some. And he says, I've got more leisure time to talk with my friends and so on, for example, now. But he says, I view it in a more positive way. So, like, I think it's really the attitude that you bring to it. And he also says, as an aside, I don't think these guys have ever been happy, to be honest. And now they're even more unhappy. You know, they were complaining when they were young, and now they're complaining when they're old. He goes, I think if you approach it with the right attitude, though, then, you know, it doesn't have to be a negative experience. It's all in your attitude, he says. So it's not surprising that Epictetus then uses Socrates as an example, because he had this idea of cognitive distancing. But this concept has become very prominent in therapy, because more recently the third wave researchers in CBT, Beck argued, one of the founders of cognitive therapy argued, look, in cognitive therapy we get clients to question the evidence for the beliefs that are upsetting them. So somebody says, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms. And the therapist will say, where's the evidence for and against that belief that nobody likes you? And they might get them to evaluate that. But Beck says there's a prerequisite for that. Before you can even get started doing cognitive reappraisal, you have to get the client to treat that belief as if it was a hypothesis. Like, if they just think, I'm just describing what I see, it's a fact that everybody hates me, then they're not going to be in a position to start weighing up the evidence for and against it. It's unquestionable. They just think they're describing something that they can see right in front of them. They have to separate that belief from their external experience and realize it's something that they're imposing on events. It's an interpretation, an attitude, it's something they're projecting before they can begin evaluating. They have to treat it as a hypothesis, recognize it as a belief, rather than fusing it with external reality. And so this tendency to fuse things with external reality is seen now as a fundamental problem in much psychopathology. It's a central focus on modern third wave psychotherapy. And the Stoics were way ahead of their time in clearly highlighting this problem. Marcus phrases it differently. Throughout the Meditations, he talks over and over again about separating his mind from external events, separating his value judgments from external events. Life is opinion. It's all about the interpretation that you impose on things. So you have to realize that you are imposing an interpretation, because we tend to forget that. We confuse our opinion with reality. And so the first step of cognitive therapy and the first step of Stoicism is realizing that we're doing that. And actually what the third wave therapists found was that when you do that rigorously enough, you don't even have to start disputing the evidence for it, for and against, in many cases. They realized that once you gain cognitive distance, those negative beliefs become less evocative and less disturbing. So they thought, what happens if we just train people in distancing? Stephen Hayes, the founder of acceptance and commitment therapy, did research on that, founder of ACT, and he called it comprehensive distancing. He said, what happens if you just did that bit? We thought it was preparation for therapy, but maybe it could be the whole therapy. And they found that that works about as well, and in some cases maybe even better, than disputing the evidence for negative beliefs. And it's a lot simpler, because there's kind of only one thing now that you need to do. And ACT researchers also realized that this idea didn't come from Buddhism, but it's similar to things that happen in meditation. So when you're meditating and thoughts pass through your mind, you have to gain a certain amount of distance from them, not to be sucked into them and drawn along with them. So this kind of attitude of mindfulness and detachment became very important in modern therapy, and third wave therapists started to draw on Buddhism. But ironically, they could have looked at the Stoics, This mindfulness, which the Stoics call prosoche, continually being aware of the way that we're projecting our beliefs onto external events, our tendency to fuse our thoughts with reality, prizing those apart, constantly being aware of that, is integral to ancient Stoicism. But it was one aspect of Stoicism that Beck and Ellis ignored, like when they developed what we call second wave or early cognitive behavioral therapy, and then it was reintroduced under the influence of Buddhism. So I like to encourage modern cognitive behavioral therapists to realize that there are mindfulness practices already in the Stoic literature that complement this passage from Enchiridion 5. So I think I'll wrap things up there, because really I wanted to just give you a sample of some of the Stoic techniques that I think are most important, and talk a little bit about the practical application, give you a few anecdotes. And then I was hoping to kind of throw it open to questions and see if I can, because you guys have been meditating today, so I reckon that your questions are going to be really cool, and I like to do Q&A. So will we throw it open for Q&A now, if you guys are ready? Do we have
Thanks so much for your talk.
Cheers.
So I think we will have time for 3 or 4 questions. Does anyone in the audience have a burning one right off the bat for Donald?
Great, thank you so much for the talk. The exercise you were mentioning at the end of the distancing, it reminded me of just the skeptic therapeutic program. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit perhaps on your opinion on the downsides to that, because I think the Stoics would disagree that just doing that is healthy. They would think we should do the second step. And I guess I was wondering your opinion on that.
The Stoics kind of talk about suspension of judgment in the same way as the skeptics, but I suppose what the Stoics would say is that we shouldn't do that in relation to virtue. They think we can grasp the nature of the good or the nature of virtue with certainty. And so Marcus actually talks about that in some cases. He talks about applying a similar technique, and he says, apply this to everything in life except virtue. All right. And I should mention one of my favourite techniques, I'll just mention in passing. In ACT, clients are taught to take a problematic statement that maybe encapsulates a judgment and to say it really quickly for 1 minute. So you might say, everybody hates me, 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 and it becomes really awkward very quickly. But it makes you much more aware of it as an activity. It becomes cumbersome. So you become more aware of the awkwardness and the fact that you're actively engaging in the thought. You take more ownership for it because you've made it awkward and you've made yourself more self-conscious of it. That creates cognitive distancing, and it tends to make people then feel that the thought is less distressing. It seems kind of arbitrary to them. They go, well, I could say that to myself, but I don't have to. It's like something that it's a habit I've got into, and I could just stop saying it.
Thank you so much for your talk, Donald. I actually had a question that I guess kind of builds off of that, but you talked a little bit about how comparing ACT versus CBT, you said there's like interesting evidence and different populations who benefit more from not cognitively challenging every single thought as opposed to this like radical acceptance kind of piece, and how you've seen some benefit in that. I would love to hear your thoughts on like what kind of people benefit more from that, or like what the rationale is for someone benefiting less from constantly cognitively like challenging each thought and like evidence for, evidence against, versus just to like the radical acceptance, and when you've seen that work.
The research on that, there's still emerging research on that, but the short answer to it is that most CBT practitioners will say that clients with generalized anxiety disorder or certain obsessive compulsive clients sometimes find it difficult to do traditional CBT because, I mean, to put it very glibly and just give you an example, in CBT you give the client a little form to take home and you go, write down what thoughts went through your mind, and then in this little column jot down the evidence for and against. And some of the GAD clients who have generalized anxiety disorder, which is basically pathological worrying. They'll come back to the next session and go, you told me to write stuff down, so I've written 10 pages. Like, I've got all these sheets here, like, the thoughts went through my mind. And you go, whoa, okay. Now you're like massively overthinking it, right? So for them, the process of thinking becomes sticky because they're so fused with it. And so the disputation itself becomes something that they become too immersed in. And so we need to kind of teach them to be able to take a step back from that and not get swept away by their thoughts as much. And it doesn't necessarily correspond with particular diagnoses, although some are more problematic than others. Maybe just be certain personality types aren't really suited to disputation because they get too lost in the weeds, basically. And sometimes it's helpful to do something that's less discursive.
Hi, just a question on the, I guess the sort of the spirituality side of it. How much for you is Stoicism and CBT purely a technique to overcome psychological issues, and how much of it is there a spiritual, religious element to Stoicism?
Well, I'm an agnostic, right? But I got into all of this stuff because as a teenager I was interested in Buddhism and world religions, and cut a long story short, it was studying Christianity that led me to Neoplatonism that led me to Stoicism via the Gnostics, basically. So that was my background bringing me into it. And when I was at university studying philosophy, I also studied history of religions. I studied Buddhism and Hinduism. So I do kind of have that perspective. But over the years, as I've got more into Greek philosophy, I guess in a sense my outlook has become secularized, although I guess in a sense there's still I find it hard to kind of draw the line as to what I would qualify as mysticism. Bertrand Russell, this is an indirect way of answering your question. Bertrand Russell, who was famously an atheist, said that he considered studying the whole of human history in an overview the closest that he could imagine to a religious experience. And that reminds me of the view from above. So I think the view from above, even if I approach it in a kind of secular, rational way, it's kind of quasi-mystical experience, perhaps. And some people tell me, they say, Donald, you're a mystic because you're into all this kind of stuff. And I think, well, I don't know if I really view it that way. And then I think maybe we're just kind of mincing words or whatever. So if you want to call that a kind of mystical or a spiritual aspect, then I guess I'm good with that. Although I tend to think of it more as a philosophy and a rational way of viewing things. We done? Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.